All right. Okay, let's get started here. Get rid of that little bookmark sign. There we go. Okay. Let me find a question slide here. Interesting. Back to, why is my Q&A software being blocked? Sorry, this will just take me 1 minute to fix. It's usually pretty straightforward. Okay. I feel like the last few days I've just been playing around with tech problems with the ongoing issues with Canvas, so this is super fun. This one happens now and then. All right, uninstall. And I just have to find it and repair the software, and we should be good. Modify and repair. Okay, so I'm just going to start talking here just while Slido gets going here. So I don't think we are going to be affected in any way by the issues with Canvas. I'm assuming you all have some sense that Canvas was hacked on Thursday, kind of globally, and so it's been down on and off for the last few days, and some software is impacted. But I don't think it's going to do anything for us. Will this work? Is the question. So I think we are okay, and like the midterm, almost there. The midterm that is scheduled for next Wednesday shouldn't be affected in any way. I think everything will be it's already working, that aspect, and everything else hopefully will be sorted out by then. My SOC 100s that have an exam on Friday, I'm less hopeful, but hopefully, because I need to use Lockdown browser for that, and it is currently not working, which is where I spent most of my morning trying to figure out alternatives. If you're a tech wizard who happens to know some kind of great alternative, I'd love to hear that. Otherwise, I spent a lot of time doing that. So as soon as Slido reinitializes any minute now, I should be able to get started, or I might just have to cancel and abandon all hope. Didn't realize it wasn't working before because I didn't test it. Okay, so I'll keep talking without slides. Okay, so for today, what we're going to do basically is we're going to keep talking about our generational cohorts and a little bit about how their, what their experience has been, how their experiences have been shaped, particularly by the technological context that they grew up in. So last time we talked about, come on, Slido, do me a solid and finish installing. Last time, what we ended up talking about was three of our older generations that are kind of in, alive now. The silents, who are mostly now dead, right? There's not a whole lot of silence left kicking around. This really, this generation born kind of from 1925 until the end of the Second World War. Super influential generation, right? A lot of the things that we tend to credit generations after them with, right? The civil rights movement, so racial equality, gay rights, and the feminist movement, a lot of them find their, super helpful. A lot of them find their origins in, in the silent generation. So we talked a lot about them. And again, what's really notable about the silence, amongst other things, is basically, they had a lot of children. Did that fix it? Okay. Hopefully that works now. Maybe not. Slido for Windows is using files that are needed by Slido for Windows. Super helpful. All right, we'll keep talking. This could be I might have to uninstall it or reinstall it entirely, which would be super fun. Usually this works. I've done this dozens of times. Okay. So when we talk about our silence, right, one really notable thing about them is how many children they had, right? So marriage really, really early. They had children quite early as well, and lots of them, right? They reversed a 2 centuries trend, basically, in declining fertility. All of that gets erased essentially as soon as the silence exit the system, right? And as soon as they're sort of done having children, what we get is the boomers, and the boomers largely go back to that more historical norm, which is sort of declining childbirth rates. Okay. Let's end task on that. Oh, now there's 3 instances of Slido running. That was super duper helpful. No. Okay. I know, this is great. I'm like half distracted and trying to talk to you. I promise I will fix it. If only I didn't love my little extension so much. Is it working now, though? Oh, it is working. Sort of. Yeah, all right, good times. I don't know how I fixed it, but I did. I mean, I know what I did. I just don't know why it worked. Okay, now all the things I did to shut down as much power consumption are all undone. So let's close Task Manager. Okay, so I was talking about the boomers. I guess, we're talking about our technological context for a lot of our generations. I'm just going to fast forward through this as we go. Both of the silence and the boomers, TV is really, really important, right? For the silence, they're the first generation to really experience TV, and it broadens their horizons. For the boomers, right? I'll get to that in a second. For the boomers, right, TV is there most of their lives, right, except for those older boomers, right, born more in the 1940s, who grew up before television's a major consumer product, right? The boomers, television's still really important, and especially important for bringing things like the Vietnam War into their living rooms. Again, showing them other perspectives, other parts of the world brought into their living room, and having that kind of horizons broadening. Is it? Hang on. Okay, that should be fixed. It was not showing the slides because I was having tech issues. Let me just double check on my phone. It works. Okay. Too much technology sometimes. Okay. Okay, so yeah, what was I saying? I keep getting it. I interrupt myself. All right, focus. Right, so the boomers. We had our other technologies, right? Where are my technologies for the boomers that I said are really important? All right, these ones, right? And again, so TV is really important. Birth control. They're the first generation to really have access to birth control through basically their entire reproductive lives, right? So obviously this changes things, right? Gives women control over fertility, right? So they tend to have fewer children, allows them to return to the workforce much more actively and earlier, right? Because their childbearing years tend to be shorter, and separates sex from conception, so you get a lot more sexual experimentation. And then I highlighted these things, right? Our labor-saving devices, dishwasher, washing machine, in particular, that freed up a lot of the domestic labor time that women were putting in to just keep households running and allowed them to put that time to other things like work. Okay. Then we talk about Gen X, right? So Gen X is this, pre-1980s generation, right? They would have grown up largely in the 1980s and early 1990s. A pretty small generational cohort, right? By comparisons to, especially the one that came before the boomers and the one that comes after the millennials, which are both larger generational cohorts than they were. Interesting thing about our Gen Xers, they are analog rather than digital, right? So they grow up before the internet. They're the last ones, or the first ones, to not be drafted into the military in the US. And they have a few firsts, right? The first generation with video games, but they are less culturally fragmented because there's fewer cultural choices, right? So they're a much more unified generation. And like I said last time, you can still talk to Gen Xers and they still all have these shared cultural touchstones. Okay. Can I clarify? Oh, I'll go back here. So yeah, please.
Sorry, what is this slide that you keep going back and forth to?
Which one?
The one where the question was?
Oh, this is Slido. Slido is basically like a Q&A kind of system that's built into PowerPoint. So every now and then it'll show up. Like I think I have it spaced roughly every 4 slides. And if you scan that QR code, you can just type in questions if you're too shy to ask questions, which clearly you're not. But yeah, it's just a Q&A system, or you can go to slido.com and enter that code. So does that make sense? Okay, perfect. Yes, I forgot to re-explain that in case people joined later. Okay, because I guess you could have joined Thursday, right? You could have joined the class on Thursday because it was still open. Okay, talked a little bit about our Gen Xers, right? They become more materialistic, which we see in their sort of cultural goals, especially around education, more around feeling financially well off. Mental health, again, this is the hard slide to read, or the hard chart to read, so I won't reiterate what's on here, but Gen X has tended to have better mental health than the baby boomers in particular. Okay. And declining social trust, right? Along a lot of measures, Gen Xers, we're at the forefront of a decline in social trust that's generally held since then. Okay, so we're talking then about the millennials, and we ended off talking about the millennials, 1980 to 1995, and we'll get back up to where we were in a second. The millennials, right, a really interesting generation, possibly the best generation of all. In all of human history, there's never been a generation quite like millennials. I say that as a millennial, born, 1982, so right at the beginning, kind of the millennials. The millennials are the first generation with the internet, right? They grew up with the internet as a pervasive part of their lives. The oldest of the millennials would have been about 13 to 15 when the internet, becomes widely available as a consumer sort of service. And it's been everywhere ever since then. So sometimes people talk about them as digital natives rather than being analog. And again, the first generation to really have social media, though not in the form it is today, in their emerging adult years. So that shapes them and again shows them a lot more of the world, and that connection is much more pervasive. Okay, we'll skip through these because we talked about these last time. And you can always go watch through. Fewer children, fewer marriages. Okay, so this is the slide that someone was asking a question on. Okay, so this is, hang on, I have to find my question slide. The chart is for millennials in Canada or the US. I'm seeing differing charts that say the opposite, especially for Gen Z. Okay, so, this is like a whole unit in my SOC religion class, and I don't want to get into it, but yeah, so these numbers are specifically for millennials, and this is millennials in the US, right? The growth of the nuns, right, so this group of nothing in particulars, grows really, really strongly. And dear God, I want to pull up my SOC of religion slides to explain this to you, but that would be a whole other course. Grows really aggressively through the 90s and into the 2000s, through the 2010s. And it's kind of flatlined in the 2020s, right? So the growth of the nuns has kind of flatlined. And there's some indication, right? And now what I will say is I would treat this very, very skeptically, that there seems to be some reversal amongst some millennials and Gen Z now becoming more religious than they were in the past. I would say this is quite preliminary. It's often from and I say this as someone who's relatively warm to that opinion, I think it's sometimes cherry-picked from very specific data sources. And largely, we haven't seen a ton of it yet. There might be some sense in which Gen Z is more religious than millennials were, but I think we need more data. We've only had a couple of years of data suggesting that that's the case. So, I mean, this is a big debate going on amongst social scientists right now, and there's some pretty vicious battles in sociology of religion circles around whether we're seeing a religious revival of sorts. I, at this moment, would say there's some preliminary evidence that yes, but if you look at the bulk of millennials and Gen Z, we're now into a really large plurality or even a majority of both millennials and Gen Z that identify as nothing in particular, more so even in Canada. And Canada tends to be well ahead of the United States in terms of this kind of what you could call secularization. Anyway, I hope that answered the question. I don't know. Did that answer your question? I hope so. But yeah, there's some cherry-picked data out there that I think you have to be really careful about, because, for as many sources saying there's this big surge in religion amongst Gen Z, I could point you to especially gold standard studies like the General Social Survey in the US, the British Social Attitudes Survey in the UK, that are pointing in the opposite direction. So I think it's still contested ground, and that should be treated with a measure of caution, though it is certainly fun to talk about. Okay, I think we talked about optimism. Yes, millennials are a very optimistic generation. Tend to see regrets as not something they want to have. Even negative social experiences tend to be framed in the positive, right? As being, people have no regrets. And everything, right, is about, even the bad things that happen to you are about making you who you are. Okay, and now we come to exactly where we were. And I'm sorry it's taking me so long to fix the Slido and get back to here. Millennials, right, tend to be deeply postmodernist in their understanding. And I'm going to put this in a little box, and I'm going to make a big arrow pointing to it. Because, right, while I don't have postmodernism on this slide, it's pretty clear that millennials have deeply absorbed the kind of theories and ideas of postmodernism, despite most of them never having read any postmodern philosophy or theory or whatever it happens to be. They're not sure objective truth can ever be discovered. And in Smith and Snell's interviews, right, and I love this quote, I pointed it out last time, they have a hard time, for whatever reason, believing in or conceiving of, a given objective truth, fact or reality or nature. Bless you. The sneeze fest in here today. or nature of the world independent from their subjective self-experience, right? So very subjectivist, right? Very much like, if you come to moral statements for millennials, there's a lot of, well, I feel that, or it might be true for me, but it might not be true for you, right? So concrete moral claims are very hard for millennials to get their heads around because they're so deeply postmodernist in their understanding. Okay, and I love this one. Despite, having no kind of objective sense of, objective moral norms, they think morality is really easy, right? Morality is common sense. How do you know what's right or wrong? Well, you know what feels good, right? So you attend to your feelings, and what feels good is probably right. Where does it come from? Well, parents, teachers implant it when they're young. Why those parents or teachers should have any moral authority to teach anything, again, is not particularly understood or thought about. It's just there. And yeah, millennials tend to think of living morally as something that's relatively effortless, right? You just attend to your feelings, and you do what feels right, and there you arrive at the right thing. Okay. So, what is the principal idea? And I think here now we're into new content. What is the principal kind of moral idea that millennials tend to hold to? Well, it's basically, right, number one rule, don't do harm, right? That you shouldn't do harm to others. And Smith and Snell basically describe millennials as moral consequentialists, right? Okay, so what is a moral consequentialist, right? And it's a form of ethics, right? It's a philosophy of ethics that basically means that any moral decision is judged in its morality based on its outcomes, right? So the consequences of a choice determines its morality. And the key principle for millennials is whether it harms other people, right? So an action is only immoral if it harms someone else. So when it comes down to things, and you see this in lots of surveys of millennial kind of moral reasoning, and Smith and Snell included a bunch of moral reasoning questions in the National Study of Youth and Religion, which is where this data comes from, right? It might not be immoral to cheat on a test since it doesn't hurt anyone else, right? If, say, a class isn't curved and you cheat on a test and you get a really high grade, that helps you and it doesn't harm anyone else. So there really is no problem at the end of the day. Now, always, why hurting others, is morally wrong was something millennials have a really hard time articulating, right? Again, because there are no kind of objective moral facts that they can draw on that they believe exist. Basically, not hurting others, Smith and Snell say, is a free-floating, unjustified supposition, right? When you ask, why is it wrong to harm others? And, well, it just is, right? So it's just common sense that not harming others is a good thing to do. Now, a minority of millennials, also had some ideas that kind of float, I would say, around almost quasi-religious ideas, karma being a really common one, right? So you shouldn't do bad things because, the universe has a certain logic and balance. So if you harm other people, you too will end up being harmed at the end of the day, right? Evil begets evil, that sort of thing. What goes around comes around. Karma's a bitch, and all of that stuff. And yeah, it's a sort of pop culture way of explaining, the fair operation of the universe, rather than, say, actually deeply understanding what is meant in, say, Buddhism or Hinduism as karma. Okay, hang on. I forgot to turn on something. I'm going to turn on my subtitles because I forgot. Okay, so in terms of their moral beliefs, millennials are deeply relativistic, right? Like I said a couple seconds ago, largely their moral reasoning is that everybody sort of has to figure out what's right and wrong for them, right? That you can't make objective and universalist moral claims. And I'll say, I've done this with my friends. You can get people really spun around on this if you really want to, right? Because, if you really want to get into weird moral debates with people, and I do that sometimes because it's fun, you could be like, so, there's no objective morality. So, I mean, I guess if the Nazis thought that what they were doing was right, then it was right for them, but it's not right for you. And I've gotten people to agree with this statement, which is super fun. Which I don't believe at all, but it's still super fun to get people to say things that they don't mean, because they're so twisted around by their kind of lack of moral objectivity. Super fun. This is why you become a PhD in sociologist, so you can mess with your friends in debates at the bar. Entirely. Okay. I suppose there might be other reasons as well. Right. Nobody can impose or presume the perspective of another person, so you can't know what's right or wrong for everyone, and everyone has to decide morality for themselves. Cultural relativism, right? So again, there is no kind of cultural standard that is held as better than another, right? Basically, from a cultural perspective, all cultures are essentially equal. And it's, at the end of the day, there is no kind of superior cultural position. Okay, the other thing, they are all deeply socially constructionist, right? So they believe, and here is the statement, right? They believe the social world is changeable, right? So nothing is given. Historically contingent, right? So it exists only as a result of particular historical circumstances and processes, and basically invented by human beings through the creation of shared norms and values, right? And you could scarcely have, a more sociological statement. So you see how deeply kind of sociological thought has affected millennials, and because this definition, comes right out of, Peter Berger and his book with Thomas Luckman, The Social Construction of Reality, which I'm sure you've all read. That's the joke you laugh at? It's a classic of sociology of knowledge, which again is clearly something every student in a third-year sociology class, will have read at some point. No, I'm kidding. No one reads it. And that's okay, right? But again, you could take this definition almost straight from Peter Berger. But again, I doubt most millennials have ever read Peter Berger. I mean, I have, but I'm weird. And a PhD in sociology, so I guess I should read that stuff. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, really deeply embedded in that. And what do we get out of them, right? Morality is often couched in I feel statements. I know, I think. Those statements are less common than I feel for millennials, which again, super fun and interesting. Okay, now, relationships. And all of these things, right, we're going to see carried forward to Gen Z. And I would suspect, though they're too young for a lot of these things, and maybe things will change, right? I'm bad at making predictions. I said Ottawa would beat the Carolina Hurricanes, so clearly I know nothing. But we definitely see these same trends kind of fall. That's the one? All right. Following through to Gen Z. We won't see this with Gen Alpha, but I suspect these trends will probably continue. All right. Relationships. And we'll talk about this once we get to the families unit, because we'll talk about things like long-term relationships and marriages. But for millennials, when they were young, what did they think? Well, they got married later than their parents did, right? So they got later married later than the boomers or Gen Xers did. And largely why? Well, youth, when you're young, is a time of self-discovery, right? So especially this period that we call emerging adulthood, right? Oh, that's the wrong thing. I just went forward. I'm too close to the buttons now. Okay. I can't win. Emerging adulthood, right? So 19 to kind of 29, roughly. that is the time where you are supposed to discover yourself, right? Find your passions, travel, secure yourself as an individual, particularly around things like education and career. And it's only once you get there, right, that you can think about settling down, right? So, career stability and income come before children, marriage and children. This is referred to, and we'll talk about this later in the course, as the capstone model, of marriage specifically, but of relationships in general, right? Your serious relationships are a capstone to an already essentially fully formed adult life. And again, this has moved marriage and childbearing closer to this number than any generation before. Okay, now again, I don't know if this will resonate with your experiences. Like I said, a lot of the things that started with millennials, kind of continue on with Gen Z. But millennials, especially in those emerging adult years, tended to, display a preference for a detachment in relationships, right? Which, is a fancy academic-y way of talking about hookup culture, right? Less likely to want to commit, especially long-term when you're young, right? Much more likely to go through a variety of relationships. And, relationships, a lot of we'll say social scripts. That's an arrow. The social scripts. Oops, I know how to spell. Social scripts, right? So basically, kind of cultural codes that tell us how we're supposed to behave in particular circumstances. So the social scripts around dating and relationships for the millennials largely break down, right? Now, again, this is part of a process that starts with the boomers and the sexual revolution. It continues on with Gen X, and we talked with Gen X about how, a lot of the kind of way that you go about life, especially around relationships and children, got a little bit scrambled, right? They had children and then they had sex, they had children and then they got married, or a scramble of that kind of order, right? This continues with the millennials, right? And a lot of the scripts around dating, around relationships, essentially get broken down. And especially if you compared it to, say, the Silence a couple generations earlier, the Silence had these really clear social scripts, right? So how you got into a relationship was, okay, well, first you would go through a kind of like courtship phase, right? Where you would probably have, some kind of dating encounters, right? There's a really clear sense of what early dating meant, and then what it meant to go steady, right? What it meant to, they had certain markers, like the male would give some kind of token of a lasting relationship, usually, the pin from their high school or their the college that they were at in university, right? Which was called pinning, right? Bless you. And then, you would get engaged and then you would get married. It was this very clear progression. You would move through steps in a relationship. That's all gone by the time we hit millennials. And so, they start to generate a whole bunch of new relationship phases, a whole bunch of new relationship vocabularies, right? From millennials, we get hookups, we get, friends with benefits, hanging out, the talking phase. Okay, I guess situationship is more of a Gen Z-ism, but it's the same idea, right? If someone could explain to me what the fuck a situationship is, just super appreciated, because my kids keep using this, and I'm like, they've tried to explain it to me, and it's like a sneeze that never comes out. I'm like, how is that a relationship description? I don't really understand. And then they roll their eyes, and the conversation ends. You know what I'm talking about, right? But you get this, it's much less defined, and there's much less certainty about how you move through these phases. So you also get things like the define the relationship talk, right? And of course, a lot of this gets amplified in its intensity by things like dating apps, right? Or dating websites, prior to the app economy really being dominant. A lot of this gets kind of messed up. And yeah, we get a lot of weird vocabulary out of the millennials. And again, that continues with Gen Z. Okay, and hooking up gets really common, right? Largely, and again, we'll talk about this when we talk about relationships in sex and intimacy. Especially when you're young, hookups become really common, largely because, well, right? Your youth is a time to try things, find your passions, and relationships are seen as a barrier to that, right? They're seen as a barrier to self-discovery, but sex is still important, so millennials kind of find a way to balance the two. They're also really busy, and so sex or hookups are seen as an efficient, and again, not my words, there's a bunch of research on this, which I'll show you later in the course, an efficient way to fit sex in to busy lives. Okay. And yeah, it's, the hookup is also very broadly defined, especially in the university college age, as anything from like kissing all the way to sexual intercourse. But again, more on that later. Okay. Millennials are also a little bit weird. Marriage is not going anywhere as a social institution, though it's definitely become less popular. But most millennials, tend to want to cohabit before marriage as a buffer against future divorce. Basically having watched a lot of their baby boomer parents, right, go through divorce. And the 80s is sort of like the peak of divorce, right? Because in Canada and the US, no-fault divorce becomes possible in the 1980s, and we get a huge spike of divorces amongst silent and the baby boomers. And so a lot of our millennials saw their parents getting divorced and lived in divorced households, and they mostly didn't enjoy that experience. So they want to essentially test drive a lot of relationships as a way of making sure they don't get divorced. It doesn't really work as a strategy. Cohabitation isn't really a particularly successful way to avoid divorce, but it still becomes the cultural norm for millennials, right? Okay. In their relationships, in their lives, millennials want to mitigate as much risk as possible. And yeah, living with someone is a test, an attempt to mitigate, to find out if you really like the person, if you're really compatible, if there are any foundational problems that you can't work through or are going to bug you so much that the relationship kind of falls apart. Is that it? Oh, you're just fixing your hair. I thought that was a question. No, it's okay. Sorry, I don't mean to point you out. I haven't seen a question slide in like forever. I seem to have forgotten to put them in past a certain point. Oh dear. Okay. Okay. Mention that. See, you should come take my sociology of religion class. So Gen X is on the same trajectory as the millennials, not quite as far along. See, now I have to look in the charts that are inside my brain. It's somewhere around, current numbers. It's somewhere around 44-ish% of American millennials that would report no religion generally. For Gen X, it's still pretty high. It's about a third reporting no religion. So they're still along that kind of trajectory. If you look at other markers of religion other than just religious identification, things like religious service attendance, prayer, reading some kind of religious text, they're all dropping as you go through with Gen X, right? So I mean, I guess if I go, I have to go back to this chart. It might look here, right, like the Gen Xers who are, I guess, in gray, are pretty high. Believe in God is quite a bit higher than, say, it is for the millennials. Where does this data come from? The General Social Survey, 2018. I mean, it's higher, but again, when we talk about our millennials here, and our millennials are in black, we're still talking big majority positions, right? They're still believe in God is almost 70%. Ever attend religious services is lower. Gen X is a little bit higher here, but it's not massive. They're not massively more religious than millennials are, right? And that nihilism, isn't just related to religion. You can still be kind of religious and fairly nihilistic. You can certainly look at a lot of apocalyptic new religious movements that are very, very nihilistic at the end of the day. There just seems to be something else in the water when it comes to Gen X. Maybe that sense of, impending death that the Cold War brought, or the fact, and we'll talk about this when we talk about economics, that their opportunities compared to older generations were fairly constrained, right? Economically, they didn't do as well as the boomers, and they knew it, which can sort of contribute to an idea that you're not doing great, right? And that the world is kind of set up against you. Okay. I don't know if I'm just going to take one quick peek at something. Did I forget to put Q&A slides everywhere? I always thought I had tons of them in here. There we go. Oh, let's just do a smattering here. Oops. Oh, I had one there. Apparently I forgot to put them only in specific places. Just where I didn't want to answer questions. Okay. I don't know. All right. Well, I've put a few more in. No, I want to answer questions. Always. All right. The American dream, right? Or what do they want out of life, right? And I have this labeled as the American dream. Like their Gen X kind of forebears, millennials are pretty materialistic, right? They want stuff, right? And they live in a consumer culture. And yeah, they expect that living a good life is a life of consumption, right? Now, is that consumption moral? As long as you can afford it, right? It is perfectly moral. You are entitled to buy whatever you can afford. So millennials, though a little bit later, some of them will come to be more concerned with, say, environmental questions, climate change, and such. Largely when they're young, their belief is, yeah, consumer culture is good. They want the American dream, right? Home ownership, car ownership, vacations, stuff, right? All very normal for millennials. Less common, right? So a minority position amongst them is that there should be some kind of like giving back or taking care of others or social responsibility. But largely, that is something that is seen as something for later. So it's a lot like children and relationships, right? So volunteering, donating, and actually helping people is something that they would do later on in life rather than when they are young, right? That's for older, more established people, kind of like getting married and having a relationship. And most of them, what do they want? It's a middle-class life, right? House, cars, dogs, children of various numbers, increasingly with dogs and cats outnumbering children. But that's neither here nor there. I think my favorite comment from one of our grad students, obviously Gen Z more than millennial, was, what is it? Plants are the new pets, pets are the new children, and children are the new Ferraris, right? Like the thing you're just aspirationally never going to be able to own or have. So there you go. That slide did nothing. Okay, I'll fix that when we take a break. Okay, along with that, right? So along with this kind of sense of, volunteering and taking care of each other is for later, weirdly, despite thinking that everything is social constructs and therefore changeable, millennials weirdly were kind of nihilist in this way too, in the sense of, they really doubted that anyone could change the world for the better. It's like, we think everything is changeable from gender roles to anything in society, but we don't actually believe that we can change anything, right? And millennials really, especially when they were young, were deeply sort of engaged in their private lives, right? Interpersonal relationships, and not particularly interested in big questions of public policy or questions of, say, like the common good, like what's good for the world, right? And so what Smith said, in 2011 was, few were engaged in any of the major cultural or ethical debates. facing U.S. society at the time, which would have included things like the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Most of them just didn't care. Almost none had a sense of the common good, right? If you ask them, what is the common good? No sense of that, right? So no sense of shared ethics or shared duties particularly, right? They're very individualistic. Their thinking has moved on mostly to rights. And so things like shared duties are not things that they talk about. And citizenship, right? Not something that they tend to talk about, right? And very, very submerged in their personal lives, right? Very interested in, what makes an emerging adult happy for them, good relationships with friends, families, interesting acquaintances and associates. And those things were all increasingly migrating to social media. All right. Enough about me and my generation. Now on to Gen Z, right? Now this, this generational kind of spacing, some people kind of disagree with the years. Some people want to put Gen Z starting a little bit later and ending a little bit later. I think conventionally this is sort of the dating that we've got. I know my daughter really hates this. She's born right in 2010. Oops. So she is technically the last of Gen Z, and my son is born in 2012, which puts him right at the beginning of Gen Alpha. And she insists that they share nothing in common whatsoever, right? That he's Gen Alpha and Gen Alpha is so cringe. And even though she's just 2 years older than him, that she comes from a completely different generation. Now, like the millennials that are born at the beginning of the 1980s. A lot of kind of older millennials will say they share more in common with, say, Gen X. I often feel that way, being born in 1982. A lot of these kind of, earlier born Gen Zers will be much more like millennials, and our later born Gen Zers will be have much more in common with the older part of Gen Alpha. Again, these generations are kind of helpful constructs to think about things. They're not definitive. Just because you're born 2 years later doesn't mean you're necessarily Gen Alpha and thus cringe. Though again, my daughter would insist that my son, who is only a couple of years younger than her, is indeed the cringiest of creatures on earth. And all of his memes are bad memes compared to all of her memes. Anyway, so what is true of Gen Z? Okay, now a lot of this data is going to come from Jean Twenge's 2017 book, iGen. And specifically, she wanted to get away from Gen Z as a naming convention because she particularly didn't like it, right? She thought it was, unoriginal. Millennials for a while were called Gen Y before eventually being rebranded millennials. And then they just kind of went with Gen Z, so 2 generations after Gen X for, Gen Z. This one seems to have stuck more. She wanted to go with iGen specifically because she thought the internet and the ubiquity of the internet is the defining feature of Gen Z, right? So the internet, right? It's ubiquitous for most of the lives of Gen Z, particularly post 2007, right? So 2007 is the year that Steve Jobs walked onto the stage at Apple World. And, he announced that very famous thing that he did, that one more thing, and it was the iPhone, right? And the iPhone, that early one, though not particularly impressive, by modern standards, it really was the first smartphone targeted at consumers instead of businesses, right? There had been smartphones that could do email and web browsing before, largely made by companies like Nokia and BlackBerry, right? Or Research in Motion. But they were really targeted at, you're an executive, you need to check your email on the go. So you have this, fairly expensive, fairly clunky device with a physical keyboard. The iPhone really is aimed at consumers, right? And it targets content consumption, right? Watching videos and listening to music and Apple sort of coins the term podcast, they create a whole kind of podcast industry, first in their, the iPod, which is where it gets the name, but then later, the smartphone makes them really, really popular because they're at your fingertips, right? So targeted at consumption, and consumers really, really like it. One of the interesting things about smartphones is that compared to older technologies, right, their adoption is really, really fast, right? By the time you get a decade forward from, really the release of the iPhone, it is a majority of people that have one, right? So by the time you get to 2017, it's something like 94% of emerging adults have a smartphone. The majority of Americans have a smartphone by 2012, right? So it crosses the, majority line. And again, I think this is a really good example of technology moving really quickly and culture moving really slowly. Because while, people adopt smartphones really quickly, culture takes a long time to sort of adapt to it. We're only, I think, seeing now a culture that's really wrestling with all of the implications of what these devices, of what smartphones and everybody having a smartphone does to a culture and does to young people in particular. But the smartphone, and I think this is probably the most uncontroversial thing I'll say in the entire course, has become the defining technology for Gen Z, right? And I mean, to the point where, how to put it, when my daughter realized she forgot to plug in her phone last night and that she might have to live without her phone for one day, a minor panic attack ensued, right? And thankfully, I'm well prepared for this because I've got a bunch of those power banks, and I always keep a couple of them charged. So I'm like, okay, just plug this in, throw it in your backpack, it'll be fine. It'll be charged by the end of the day. You'll be fine, right? But she's like, oh my God, I forgot to charge my phone, right? It is really the defining technology, and how dare I say, the most important relationship most Gen Zers have is the one with their smartphone. I kid a little bit, but only a little. Okay. Now, in terms of kind of trends, one of the things that Twenge suggests is that Gen Z, in a lot of ways, is a culmination, at least until Gen Alpha shows up, of a move towards greater and greater individualism. That really, I guess, it starts with the silence and the boomers, and every generation since then has been growing more individualistic. Now, as opposed to the millennials, I would say there's a fair sense of pessimism amongst Gen Z, right? And a lot of fear and anxiety. I mean, again, we'll talk about this later in the course, like right at the end, in a few weeks' time. We're going to talk about Jonathan Haidt's book. He calls it The Anxious Generation, which is largely about Gen Z. But Gen Z also seems to be quite anxious and Twenge suggests quite fearful, right? So, amongst other things, she says they are obsessed with safety. And I will say this is both, physical and emotional safety. And again, Jonathan Haidt notes this as well in his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, where he makes the observation that once Gen Z shows up on college campuses, the kind of openness that millennials had to a lot of competing ideas kind of shuts down, and campuses come to be more focused on the emotional safety of students, and often students feeling threatened by ideas they don't like, right? So physical and emotional safety is really important to Gen Z. Anxiety about their economic futures, again, is a touchstone of Gen Z, right? Largely probably as a result of some of the struggles that millennials were facing kind of in the early years for Gen Z when they kind of become aware, right? Millennials have a tough time going through the 2008-2009 global financial crisis and recession. And they're afraid that their lives are not going to be as good as the lives of their parents or their grandparents. They're also, they're very much kind of tied into questions of equality as well. Now, again, you can see this as a continuation of trends that started with the silence that continued on with the boomers, Gen X, millennials, and again now for Gen Z are very important. But they have, as Twenge puts it, they're no patience at all for any kind of discrimination based on gender, race, or sexual orientation, right? Those are all no-goes for Gen Z, right? You cannot be racist, you cannot be ableist, right? You cannot be sexist, racist, ableist, transphobic, or any of ththose things. Those are all verboten amongst this generation. Okay, now, again, and actually probably a reversal of what we saw with, Gen X and millennials. We could say that, Gen X and millennials had a short childhood and a long adolescence. I'm just going to write addo because I don't feel like writing the whole word, right? A long adolescence. In a lot of senses, Gen Z seems to have a pretty long, so, Gen Z is a long childhood, right? And we see this especially in a bunch of markers where they hit a lot of those things that probably would have put you into that kind of teenager, emerging adult kind of frame a little bit earlier. Gen Z are hitting a lot of those things considerably later. So amongst them, right? They get their driver's licenses and their first jobs later than Gen X and millennials. And we'll see this when we look at some of the jobs data, right? Gen Z, way less likely to have jobs in their teens, right? And there's some economic things going on here as well. But there also seems to be a sort of cultural thing happening there. Less likely to date, right? So way less likely to have ever gone on a date by the time they graduate from high school, right? And even into those, college years, far less likely to date. They have sex later and less frequently than past generations. They do drugs less and smoke less and drink less as well. Things that we're starting to see reflected in like sales data of liquor in particular as they enter kind of adulthood, right? They drink less than their millennial peers did at the same time, right? But yeah, 15% fewer 12th graders had sex in 2015 than in 1991. And again, I got a bunch of interesting charts that show this, right? Way fewer of, ninth graders had sex. 50% fewer ninth graders had sex than in 1991, which again, no one should cry about this number. But it shows you how quickly Gen X was growing up, right? That a significant number of ninth graders were already sexually active in 1991. Right, so that tells us Gen X grew up really quickly and hit that adolescent stage really early, and that this trend seems to have largely reversed with Gen Z. And yeah, rates of going out without their parents also dropped, right? They're much more supervised generation, and I think I have this on the next slide, right? Parents tend to know where they are a lot of the time, right? Parents know where they are 75% of the time and who they are with 65% of the time, right? And this is back in 2017. So that is even better, right? If I wanted to open up my phone and tell you precisely where my daughter is right now, I can do that because the parent controls that I have installed on her phone also have GPS included. So, really handy. I can know where she is at any given time. And I really hope she's at school at the moment. Otherwise, we got problems. But I'm not going to check. Okay. So here's our fun little charts here. Right? Ever, all these things, right? And what do we see over time? Right? Ever date has gone down. Tried alcohol has gone way down. Worked for pay, way down. And then, right, sex as a ninth grader, way down as well. And again, you want to see how crazy that is, right? Sex as a ninth grader, it's now, below 20%, close to 10%, and that's 2021 numbers. When we're talking about Gen X, so we're almost 40% of Gen Xers, right, had sex in the ninth grade, which is like a crazy number to me. Anyway, I don't know why it's a crazy number. It seems like really exceptionally high. That seems quite young to be sexually active to me. But whatever, right? Really quite high, and it's declined quite a bit. And the same thing, right, for work for pay. It used to be above 50%. It's dropped below 30. Ever dated, was above 50%. And again, it's dropped to about 20% by 2021. All of those things, right, declining. And then, all right, this is our slightly old, these are our 12th graders. Similar kind of trends, right? Not as stark because they're a little bit older, but we see all of these kind of markers of emerging adulthood, right, have all declined amongst this younger cohort, amongst Gen Z, right? So we see a lot less kind of movement, bless you, into that emerging adult behavior. I really freaked someone out one time who was watching the class on a live stream because their dog sneezed, and I said bless you at the same time because someone in class sneezed, and they were like, how did you know? Obviously that you can't hear people sneezing in the room on the microphone I've got. Okay, so lots of fun things, right? Physically safer. They smoke less. They do drugs less. They drink less. They're less. So they're, and I'll say a reason for this. They're less likely to drive hazardously. They drink and drive, or they drink less and later. Less likely to get intoxicated or into a car driven by someone who's intoxicated, right? This is a big problem with Gen X in particular. And less likely to get murdered or get into a fight. Now, the reason for this, how to put this politely, they stay home a lot, right? You can't do any of these things. Well, I guess like you could try drugs or smoke or drink. You can't drive hazardously if you're sitting on the couch, nor can you get into a car, driven by someone who's intoxicated if you're all sitting at home and, chatting with each other on Discord, right? Because then you're not. Why do you laugh at that? You shouldn't. Maybe because it has a ring of truth to it, right? If you're all sitting at home chatting on Discord or whatever, right? It's hard to get into a car driven by an intoxicated person when you're not physically in the same place as an intoxicated person, right? And you are unlikely to get murdered or get into a fight in your bedroom, right? And I always say this is sort of what we call the Netflix effect. And you've heard the famous aphorism for having sex, which is Netflix and chill, right? Well, increasingly for Gen Z, there's not so much Netflix and chill, it's just Netflix, right? Everybody stays home and watches Netflix by themselves. And again, I got the receipts to prove it because, the sex number is way down for everybody. And I'll show you even more of this as we go through the course. Technology has fundamentally changed the experience of young people. They go out less, right? And again, this is a culmination of something that really starts with Gen X and with cable television. Once you get, and again, Robert Putnam talks about this in his book, Bowling Alone. Once you get cable and you have hundreds of channels to choose from, and I think home video game consoles as well, the home becomes a much more entertaining place. There's less importance in going out because, in the past, your home was really boring. That's where your parents were, and there were books, but there was nothing to do, right? Maybe there's like 3 channels, but if you didn't like what was on those 3 channels, you went out and did something. Increasingly, right, in the home, you have endless choices of what to do. And so people increasingly just stay home. And so, yeah, Gen Z is very safe from a physical perspective, but they're growing up really slowly because they're having fewer life experiences. And yeah, their parents give them less independence, right? Again, we'll talk about this when we get to the end of the course. But Jonathan Haidt calls this safetyism, right? There's all sorts of fears floating around that the world is a very dangerous place for kids. And so parents have tended to shelter them much more than they did in the past, especially if you compare to, say, Gen X. And that question slide is not working, so I really want to find one that's working. Maybe instead of flicking around and giving you all motion sickness, I'll just go back to a different one. Okay. Candles are the new plants also. Okay. That's so funny. Candles. It's more than a friendship, less than a partnership, intimacy of relationship without real obligations. That helps a bit, I think. In short, it's kind of a mess, but kind of fun, sexy. So either too hard or too fun to end. Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's 100% true. Um, is consumerism and having things closely related to the home being more fun? I mean, I guess in a sense, right? I also think like the number of options of things to do, right, on relatively low cost platforms has increased exponentially, right? Like just the number of games or videos that you can watch on your phone for free, right? Like anybody who has YouTube can remain entertained for months, probably, right? You might end up like following Andrew Tate and becoming a terrible person, but you'd be entertained while doing it, right? So, candles are the new plants. Because you can't kill them, so they're even better. That's amazing, right? So, yeah, I mean, we have more stuff, vastly more stuff, and more entertainment systems, but there's just more options in general, right? And it's much easier to stay home and, you know, consume content than it is to go out, right? And a lot of the, people complain about things like third spaces, right? Um, I think there's a relation and how there's no third spaces, right? Everything costs, you want to go do anything, it's expensive. There's no kind of, what would you, if you went outside the house, what would you even do? Because a lot of the social infrastructure that used to give people meaning and things to do has atrophied as people just have stayed home really since the 1980s in large numbers, right? Like bowling leagues still exist, but bowling leagues used to be huge, right? Because it was just an excuse to go out and throw a ball at some objects and drink beers with your friends. But now, increasingly people don't do that anymore. It's a very specialized activity, or it used to be a very common activity, right? Um, Beer leagues and even like recreational sports used to be much more common. I know there's still like adult softball leagues and stuff, but participation in those things is lower than it was in the past. Okay. I have to save these and see if these are correct definitions. Kind of a mess, but kind of fun. I mean, that's not a great definition. Doesn't really tell me anything, but okay. That's neither here nor there. Like my struggle to understand Gen Z continues. Okay, where was I? Oh, now we get into the really fun stuff. Okay, so Gen Z and gender fluidity. Now I will say, and I should include this, and I forgot. I was going to add this in, and then the Canvas stuff popped up, and I forgot to do it. Some of this is now reversing, and I'll tell you about that in a sec. One of the things that was true, really until I believe about 2021, 2022, was that amongst Gen Z, kind of questions about gender and especially gender fluidity, they basically become much more accepting of it, and many more of them were identifying in gender fluid kind of ways. Okay. Where's my pen? Okay, so coming up to 2021, like 2022, basically somewhere in the range of, 66%, 2/3 of young adults said they had become more supportive, in particular, of trans rights in the last 5 years. And I think this is a pretty uncontroversial stance as well. Gender for Gen Z is much more fluid than it was for other generations. And you see that, and again, it really seems to have kind of caught fire in a social way, starting somewhere around 2017, 2018, really until about 2022, when things have started to reverse now. We've seen the proliferation of language and terms to describe, different gender identities. I've got like the tiniest list, but you could go on and on with this, right? There's so many terms that have been sort of proffered for different gender identities, right? Really common ones being non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, and then, demi boy, demi girl, pansexual, asexual, right? All of these things kind of spreading out in sort of an endless panoply of people creating new terms to describe exactly how they identify, right? So this is really proliferated, especially amongst Gen Z. Okay. And yeah, Gen Z has shown itself generally more willing to play with gender norms. Okay, and what do you see, right, on these charts? Though the numbers are still really small, right? So we're talking here 3%. So it's not a huge chunk of the population. But you see how much more likely, say, Gen Z is to identify as either trans or non-binary than other generational cohorts. And right, percent of US adults who believe there are more than two genders, right? And you see this has been increasing over time, but the biggest increase has been for Gen Z, right? Who are a little bit more likely than other generational cohorts to think there are more than two genders. Okay. So, how am I doing for time? So good. Gen Z and gender, right? The proportion of those who identify as transgender has increased most amongst those, using the terminology assigned female at birth, right? And so we see this here, right? Which of these charts is it? Percent of US adults identifying as transgender, right? Is that what yeah. So we see, right, if we look historically, right, again, these numbers are not huge, but, amongst the boomers and Gen X, those assigned male at birth were far more likely to, though the numbers are tiny, to report, being transgender. Amongst millennials, it basically evens out with those assigned female at birth pulling slightly ahead. And amongst Gen Z, we have a huge surge, right, where those assigned female at birth become far more likely than those assigned male at birth to identify as transgender. And again, this is a reversal of these long historical trends, right? So it's very interesting in the fact that, essentially since we've sort of kept track of these things, it's never been the case. But for Gen Z, definitely has happened. All right, percent of US adults identifying as non-binary, and again, what you see is it's basically even for boomers. Gen X pulls a little, assigned female at birth pulls a little bit ahead when it comes to millennials, but there's a huge separation here between assigned female at birth and assigned male at birth amongst Gen Z. And what's this last? Oh, this is bisexuality. It's got to be bisexual. Again, a huge surge in female bisexual as an identification amongst Gen Z. Now, it surged, amongst male bisexual as well, but not to nearly the extent, right? So definitely a change in the way people think about gender and sexual identity, and it seems to be concentrated largely amongst those assigned female at birth. The biggest change is there, right? Okay. I think I've said everything here. Yeah, similar increases are also seen in those identifying as gay, lesbian, and bisexual, but bisexual by far the most. Okay, I will say one thing, and again, I don't have the charts for this. I could produce the receipts in pretty short order. I know where to find them. I just didn't have time to put them in. Since 2022, we've started to see these trends reverse, and in particular, this category, right, of female bisexual hasn't collapsed, but the preponderance of people, especially Gen Zers, identifying in this way has started to decline, right? So we've seen major declines. We've actually seen major declines along all of these categories, after 2022. So some of this seems to be reversing for whatever, mechanism we're not exactly sure, but it saw a big spike, kind of during COVID. And the further we get away from COVID, the more that spike seems to be slowing and even reversing. And again, oh yeah, please.
Is it decreasing while the other one increases, or just decreasing on its own?
So all three of these are basically like identification as transgender, especially amongst those assigned female at birth, non-binary, and bisexual are all decreasing at the same time, which means more people are moving into that, I guess what you would call more conventional kind of gender categories, which again, we don't really know why. There was a big spike at one point, and then it kind of seems to be slowly receding. And I think the reasons are poorly understood. I wouldn't even herald a guess as to why. It just seems to be happening. But Does that answer your question? Okay, perfect. Is it disconcerting me talking just straight to you? Okay, perfect. Okay, so I think I'm good with this one. All right. Okay, delayed adulthood, right? Again, we see similar signs as we saw with millennials and what I talked about earlier. Marriage and long-term relationships, right, are things that Gen Z thinks are for later, and often much later, right? Now sort of proceeding into their late 20s and early 30s, right? Even kind of preferences for marriage have declined generally, right? So, again, these are all majority positions, so we shouldn't overstate it. But, things like prefer to have a mate or a romantic partner, right? Used to be at above 85%, and it's dropped a little bit as we get, to about 2021. Again, it's still majority territory, but it's closer to 80 now. People who think they're likely to get married, I mean, it was pretty low in 1976. And it now dropped below that. So, I think the notable thing is it had spiked a little bit amongst millennials in particular, and Gen Z, it's really dipped. And then marriage and family are extremely important. That one's dipped probably the most, right? Fewer people saying now that marriage and family are extremely important to them. Okay. Now, again, things we shouldn't feel probably too bad about. Gen Z has a real, it used to be like if we talked about Gen X, teen pregnancies and teen births were endemic, right? To the point where politicians were sort of panicking about these things as a big social problem. Gen Z has essentially the lowest teen and early 20s pregnancy and birth rates of any generation ever, right? Now, largely this seems to have to do with much higher, well, they're having less sex, and, they use contraception at much higher rates. So that's dropped the birth rate. But any, thought of teen pregnancy being a huge social problem, I think essentially has fallen into the background because while it still happens, it's at its lowest rate since we started measuring it. Okay. Plus, in this economy, trying to get your money's worth from rent, assuming that's about services and products at home. Yes, that is true. What's up with that? That's a very interesting way to phrase the question. All right, let's start at the bottom here. Do we know the reason behind the increase in transgender identification amongst Gen Z? More acceptance? Are we not sure? So I think what people were thinking prior to when it started to recede was that it must have been about more acceptance, right? I think one of the sort of theories that people are starting to talk about was that potentially there's a sociogenic effect that was going on, right? As more people are talking about it, and as, especially something, and the reason that I think people think this is because female bisexual jumped so much, is that having, say, like a non-conventional gender or sexual identity came with a certain measure of social status, right? So some people have said this, so a lot of people started to identify that way, whether they actually felt that way or not. And I remember one person putting it that basically, the worst identity for a teen girl right around 2020 was being straight and white because that made you boring, right? You were kind of like vanilla ice cream, incredibly popular, but also incredibly dull. And so, teenagers don't want to be incredibly dull. And so there may have been some identification. I think the evidence for, the decline maybe fits that model. But there certainly are other pieces of evidence that don't, right? So I don't think we really know, though I think, people are now trying to explain it, and that's a popular explanation. Though again, I would be cautious with it because we have like maybe 3 or 4 years of data where it's going down. That trend may reverse at any time, and we may go the other direction. Okay. Okay, you're trying to get your rent money's worth, so you stay home. I gotcha. I see where that comment's coming from. COVID forced so many companies to provide their services and products to the home. Yes, that did I get my groceries delivered still because I don't like going to Walmart. So that's how it goes. Oh, the smoking question. Vaping's an interesting one. There's certainly some evidence that vaping sort of undid 30 plus years of no smoking campaigns, right, amongst teenagers, where teenage smoking rates had declined quite a bit. And then, when vaping came around, vaping became incredibly popular amongst teenagers. I think, we're kind of moving back in the other direction now, where vaping is actually on the decline again as some of the health problems that come with it. Um, Heavy on not bed rotting, but enjoying your rent. Love it. So we're seeing vaping rates decline, and there was a spike for a particular, again, I want to say like 2015 to about 2022, and then we've seen like some evidence of it kind of coming down again, though it still remains quite popular with teenagers, right? Okay, enjoying your rent. I gotcha. Okay, maybe should we pause for a sec? Probably should pause for a second. All right. Well, you come back at 45, 2:45. We'll finish up. We should be able to finish up talking about millennials and Gen Z, or sorry, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, and then maybe get into starting to talk about education. We'll see where we get to. And I will screen grab this for later so that I have it. Have your definitions of a situationship and see how they stand up over time. Okay, we'll see you in a little bit. I'll see if I can fix this. Okay, I guess we will keep going here. Where were we? Okay. We were here. Alrighty, so I'm going to shut the door. I don't like the door open. I don't know why. It bothers me. Okay. So one of the big things that Twenge, and then I think later on Jonathan Haidt and Zach Rausch have all been sort of focused on, and again, we'll talk about this a lot later. Towards the end of the course, I've got a whole unit on mental health. Let the taskbar go away here. But this is something that I think people are noticing in big ways with Gen Z is declines in mental health, right? Now, again, I've got a ton of charts on this later in the course, so we'll deep dive into this as we go forward. But, this is percentage of Gen Z report, or percentage of young people reporting that they are unhappy. And what we see, right, is that kind of globally, or I guess here, this is how I say globally, but across the Anglosphere, right? So our big, excluding the UK, a lot of our English-speaking countries, we see jumps in unhappiness. Now, this is actually a global phenomenon, right? You can see similar trends happening in places like Sweden, Norway, Finland, right? And all sorts of places in the world that generally score high on indexes of happiness have scored, are increasingly seeing declines in happiness and a lot of growth in depression, anxiety, and other mental health disorders, right? So Gen Z and mental health, is in a sort of fraught place. Now, again, we'll dig into this later. There's lots of reasons to think this is more than just reporting, because, some of these things, like say that they are unhappy, that's a pretty subjective measurement. But when we look at some of the objective measures of mental health, things like self-harm, right? Being hospitalized for self-harm, suicide attempts that result in hospitalization, or suicides, all of those have risen as well, right? And the reason I say those are objective measures is because the state tracks those. They've tracked them very carefully for a really, really long time. And they're things that aren't subjective, right? These are actual real world occurrences that are tracked by government data, not just by measures of, self-identification or, something where a lot of mental health conditions like depression might be susceptible to, say, Gen Z being more open about questions of mental health. Things like, self-harm, hospitalizations for self-harm, that isn't as susceptible, right? That's a pretty objective measure at the end of the day. Okay. Now, still just that. All right. Pessimism, right? So I said the Gen Z is pretty pessimistic. And again, lots of different indicators of this, right? Well, let me see if I can zoom in here to the top of the slide. This is just, so this comes from a voter survey from the Democracy Fund. I forgot I can't write on these when I have them zoomed in, right? But what do we see? Well, Gen Z is way more likely to say things like, significant changes are needed to society, right? So you're in a position where if you look at, say, the silents or the boomers, you're not in majority territory there, but with Gen X, and even more so with millennials, and then even more so with Gen Z, right? You're now in, 2/3 or 3/4 almost of young people saying they think significant changes are made. 2/3 saying that American society is unfair, and 40% saying that the founders, right? So we know in what esteem Americans hold the founding fathers generally, but that the founding fathers, right? Your Jeffersons, your Washingtons, your John Adams, your Hamiltons, right, are more villains than they are heroes, right? So that's, a marker of kind of loss of faith in the society that they live in, all of those things. Okay, if we look at this one, right, hard to have hope for the world, and wonder if there's purpose to life given the world situation. And again, none of these are majority positions, right? But if we look at, hard to have hope for the world, it definitely rises sharply from right around the time that the older part of the millennials are the ones being picked up in the sample. And yeah, this is from monitoring the future. So this is a poll that mostly looks at 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. But basically, right, we have big jumps in people saying that they feel like it's hard to have, young people saying they feel like it's hard to have hope for the world given the situation, right? It's up to about 2/5 by the time you reach 2020. And wonder if there's purpose in the world given the world situation, right? Up to a 2/3 position amongst Gen Zer, where it was, more about a quarter before that. Okay. And, it's just what they expect to get out of life. Fewer of them expect, I guess it's still a lot higher than it was back in 1976, although the economy was significantly different then. But if we look at compared to, say, millennials, right, Gen Zers are less likely to expect a professional job, right? So they're expecting to work in less secure parts of the economy. Fewer of them are saying they expect to graduate with a professional degree. That has dropped below majority territory, and expect to have more than their parents, right? It's still in majority territory by 2020, but it's just, it's dropped significantly from its peak, right around the beginning of the 1990s. And then in the early 2000s, again, when millennials were making up this part of the sample, they expected to earn more than their parents. Gen Z increasingly doesn't. Okay. How do I unzoom? Okay. And restore my pen powers. Right. So yeah, 6 in 10 Gen Zers disagree with the statement that America is a fair society where everyone can get ahead. 3/4, and that's this number here, right? 3/4 of Gen Zers, essentially think that we should tear society down and start again. 4 in 10 think the founders are better described as villains than heroes. And yeah, some of them that aren't on here, only, about a third, a little more than a third of Gen Zers said they were very or extremely proud to be American, right? So that sense of national pride had declined. Also more negative about capitalism. Only a slight majority of them said they had a positive view of capitalism. Yeah, and a lot of them, and we'll get to this again later in the class, perceive discrimination, and they perceive an external locus of control. Now, what that means, right, is basically they think that the ability to reshape their lives is outside of them, right? That there's probably nothing that they can do to improve their lives. There are these powerful external forces controlling things. Now, an external locus of control tends to be bad for you, from a mental health perspective, because if you don't think you're in control of your life, you will tend, things like depression, hopelessness will tend to be higher as well. So there's a correlation between these two things. Okay. Let's talk about a little bit about Gen Alpha. Like Gen Z, right, there's a little bit of kind of controversy as to what to actually call this particular generation, right? So the typical naming convention that we're seeing out now is to call them Gen Alpha, right? So, we got to the end of the alphabet with Gen Z. So then we go to, the beginning of the Greek alphabet, apparently. And that's the way that we're going to do things. So presumably the next generation would be Gen Beta, which I don't know if they're going to care for that one, but who knows, right? Or maybe we'll come up with better names. Some people have suggested the Polars. I don't love this one either. Jean Twenge's on, called them the Polars in her book. I can't remember why she calls them the Polars, but I didn't really love this one. So we'll go with Gen Alpha for now. Okay, now something worth noting, and I'm going to take most of the information here from this report from a group out of Colorado called Springtide Research Institute. I really like these guys, and you'll see their data kind of showing up throughout the course. They're really cool, and they do some really, really cool research, specifically tailored at looking at the lives of young people. I think a lot of it is really, really interesting. And they do this basically annually. They do this survey of usually around 2,000 American young people. And what's worth noting is that Gen Z is just starting to come into this sample. So this report is from a couple of years ago. So this looks at data, I believe from 2024, if I'm not mistaken. And in there, right, you're basically getting your first couple years of Gen Alpha in the sample, right? At the kind of bottom end of what we can do as social science researchers. Because below 13 is really, really hard to get, say, ethics approval to do research on young people. And, surveying 12-year-olds and younger is really difficult for a lot of other reasons. But they've got these fun samples that basically cover young people from 13 to 19, or is it, no, sorry, 13 to 23. And they do this annual poll looking at young people 13 to 23. And so, a couple of years ago, we started to get some Gen Alpha data sort of trickling in as the oldest of Gen Alpha turns 13. Okay. So Gen Alpha, right? Basically, by the kind of logic, we have Gen Z ending in 2010. So Gen Alpha would start in 2011. We don't have kind of a firm end date on where Gen Alpha will end, right? But you could probably, I would guess, Gen Alpha probably be somewhere around 2025, 2026 maybe, in terms of its kind of end date. So we've probably already hit the end of that, but we'll see, right? Many years after you've left this place and I'm still teaching this class 3 times a year, maybe I'll have more on when Gen Alpha ended. And I'm sure you'll care deeply by that point. Okay, so yeah, our oldest members of Gen Alpha entered their teen years, right? So turned 13 in 2024, right? So again, this is very preliminary. They're very young, and so a lot of their lives are very unformed at this point. But they're definitely now, I would say, progressing into our data sets. We're going to learn more and more about them as time moves on. Okay, so some really key points from this report. Age matters the most to self-identification, right? They're 13, and for 13-year-olds, that is a big deal. Being 13 is a major milestone for them, right? Huge milestone, becoming an adolescent, right? Not surprisingly, right? They're moving into that phase of development where peer relationships starts to be more important to them than adult relationships, right? Especially relationships with their parents. So friendships, and here Springtide notes, often racially diverse, feel really central. Every generation really since Gen X has been growing more racially diverse, right? And so, for millennials, for Gen Z and Gen Alpha, their kind of peer groups are more and more racially diverse. Okay, smartphones, they're everywhere as well, right? Smartphones feel addictive, and young people are aware of that. And there's some really, I guess this is more kind of Gen Z information, but there's some really interesting kind of reflection going on amongst Gen Z about how, increasingly they wish their parents had held back on these technologies more, and how they regret things like social media and especially explicit adult content that they were exposed to relatively young. Gen Alpha is not quite there yet, right? But for them, they feel addicted to their phones, but increasingly and somewhat different from Gen Z, who sort of lived in the smartphone Wild West in a lot of cases. Parents monitor their use, right? So there tend to be time limits placed on their devices, and parents watch what they are doing, right? So nearly all 13-year-olds say they have a smartphone, and nearly half say they're addicted to it. More than half of our 13-year-olds say they have to ask their parents' permission to use apps or sites, right? So their parents have some degree of control over their devices. And yeah, their parents increasingly limit screen time and monitor online activity. So this is a change, right? Again, when these devices sort of hit the market and were relatively new, A lot of the tools for monitoring screen time didn't exist yet, right? And B, parents, again, I'll stress this, culture is slow. A lot of parents bought smartphones for their teenagers, but it took, a solid 2 decades after the smartphone's introduction for it really to become, normal, and for parents to even, really understand the power of these devices and how much they needed to be monitored. Okay, so, this is largely, I think, a cultural reaction. And again, culture is slow. There's a little bit of lag time, and I anticipate there's more of these cultural changes to come, right? We're already seeing it with things like cell phone bans in schools, social media bans in places like Australia, and probably coming to the European Union relatively soon, maybe to Canada at some point. Given how sclerotic our political system is, I'm not optimistic. But we might get there 10 years after everyone else does. Who knows? All right, COVID's impact, right? So again, this is a generation that would have been relatively young when COVID hit. Their assessment of it was that it was positive, mixed, or neutral, right, in terms of the impact on their lives. A lot of them are, too young to have felt the big impacts of it in big ways. But inequality, right, so economic inequality particularly meant that COVID-19 was experienced unevenly. It hit the poor a lot harder than the middle class and rich. And yeah, racial and ethnic identities frame outlooks, right? Definitely there's more racial and ethnic identities in the population, right? And people see them as more important. Okay, other things. And again, maybe going back to this question that we saw earlier in today's lecture, religion and spirituality, right? That hasn't happened in a bit. Religion and spirituality, common parts of identity and life. And I think I have it. I don't know that I have it here. I think I have it somewhere else in the course. I made that joke. You can't make that joke. Right? Okay, so religion and spirituality, common parts of identity and life. And yeah, large majorities of Gen Alpha, in the States at least, identify as at least slightly spiritual or slightly religious or both. And yeah, teens who believe in a higher power and who see religion as personally important are less likely to say they feel unhappy or lonely over the past month, right? So religion, and this is a pretty robust social science finding. We've known that religion tends to make people happier, less lonely, and all of these things. We've known that for a long time, and that seems to follow through with Gen Alpha. Okay, they're not particularly political, which makes sense. They're 13 years old. So when asked what's their political identity, most of them are going to say, I don't know. Right? I haven't really thought about it. Nothing extreme there. Bless you. Climate change, right? A lot of them are worried about environmental concerns like climate change. And half of them expect their lives will turn out different and mostly worse than their parents' lives because of it. AI, obviously, they're all sort of getting accustomed to having AI as part of the ecosystem, right? So again, it's going to take a little while for culturally whatever is going to happen with AI to actually happen. But, already Gen Alpha seems pretty comfortable with it. And yeah, they see racial diversity generally as a good thing. It is pretty baked into their lives, right? And that would be true in Canada as well. And yeah, loneliness, worry, and anxiety happen, but they seem somewhat different than Gen Z in this way, right? There's already some indications, and there's always, differences between generations that, they're not as preoccupied with anxiety and they're not as worried as Gen Zers were at the same points in their lives, right? That said, right, half feel worried or anxious at least sometimes during, the 4-week period. right, in the last, over a 4 week period, right? So the last 4 weeks, right? And yeah, it doesn't dominate their life, but feelings of loneliness do crop up, right? So pretty normal. And yeah, for now, this one I do think is interesting. They seem less risk averse than Gen Z, right? And they'll say, for a good opportunity, feeling nervous or scared is okay. So they do seem to be a little bit different from Gen Z at that point, right? I love these little quotes, right? They think it's different from when their parents were 13, which makes sense, right? Most of their parents, when they were 13, lived in there's mostly millennials, right? So they might have been kind of, just at the beginning of the internet, no social media, all of that stuff. It's really hard to be 13 sometimes, but so much fun too. It's hard. Everyone wants you to be something or know who you are, right? So everyone kind of expects 13-year-olds to know what they're going to do with life. No matter how hard we try, we get disrespected and looked down on. We aren't stupid. We're young and learning. Everything is awkward. I think that's a universal feeling of every teenager ever. It's fun being 13, but it comes with mood swings as well as having to take responsibility for other things going on in life, such as chores and dealing with my younger siblings. So there you go. Okay, identity. So basically, where do 13-year-olds, right, so Gen Alpha, find their identity? Well, it's mostly, so again, not a majority, but a good plurality, is their age group. So being 13 is really important. Below that, right, gender, family status, right, son, sister, daughter, any of those things, brother, all of those things. For about 10%, it's racial identity. For a very small percent, it's religion, even smaller percent nationality, right? Sexual orientation coming in at 4%. And then, everything else is pretty low. Social class, political party, right, is only 1%, right? So they're not especially political, and they don't tend to think of themselves in political categories. And yeah, which comes close to their own view. Would they rather miss out on an opportunity if they feel scared or nervous? About a third say so, but 2/3, a little bit more than 2/3, say they're willing to be nervous or scared for a good opportunity. Okay, race, right? So, while race and ethnicity both feel important, most of them will choose just an American to describe themselves, right, rather than a racial category, although Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are more likely than their white counterparts to identify with a racial or ethnic group, which makes sense. I mean, the U.S. is still a majority white country, at least for the moment, so this kind of inherently makes sense. Let's take a little zoom on my graphs here, right? So how do 13-year-olds think about their racial and national identities? You see, right, for white Americans, right, 80% of them think of themselves as just an American. It's only about 2/5 for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, right? For white people who are white, only about 5% think about only one or one particular racial or ethnic group, so identify as with one particular ethnic group. 2 or more, it's only 2%, right? And you see for an American and 1 or more racial group, it's still only 4%, right? Those numbers are obviously substantially higher for people from, racialized groups. Okay. And how important is race or ethnicity in describing who you are? For all 13-year-olds, right, you can see only a little bit more than a quarter say it's very important. About a quarter say it's moderately important. And about, half say it's either slightly or not at all important. Obviously, much more important at 45% for, people who are from minorities. So that, again, kind of makes sense. Uh-oh. There you are. I'm so glad I figured out how to use the magnifying glass. It makes my life so much better. Okay, this is the next. It's like I said, you can't make that joke. That's my joke. I made that joke. How are the date ranges for generations decided? A dark cabal of sociologists meets in a smoke-filled room. and arbitrarily assigns dates to, I haven't been invited to the group, but, maybe in 10 years or so. No, I mean, it's kind of arbitrary, right? It tends to come from sort of observations that people from certain age ranges tended to share certain kind of formative experiences. And when we think, the formative experiences are different enough, people will sort of put a line there. They're very arbitrary, right? And some people will even talk about, say, things like microgenerations. Some people have talked about, I can't write it down because I can't write on this slide, but like instead of millennial with an M, people will put an X there for Zennials, and that'll be people kind of born at the tail end of Gen X and the beginning of the millennial generation. So they kind of share a lot in common. Some people have done the same thing with, say, but put a Z at the beginning, right? So you get Zennials, and that's sort of the end of the millennials and the beginning of Gen Z, because those people will share a lot in common as well. But mostly it's quite arbitrary, and we sort of like, I don't know, we just kind of put the lines where we think they make sense, and then we fight about it, and we try to come up with better names. Okay. Would you say that racial diversity in friend groups comes from increasing multiculturalism? I mean, yeah, I think that's it, right? Like, increasingly, the groups that they are in are racially diverse, right? And so they make racially diverse friendships. As we kind of go forward in time, Canadian and American society are more racially diverse, largely driven by immigration. And so, you meet the people you go to school with, your friendships are shaped by who's around you, and kids just don't care that much about racial categories in a lot of cases. And that's probably all it is. Okay. Is there evidence of literacy issues amongst Gen Alpha? I don't know that you're going to like the answer to this. Yeah, but there's also evidence of literacy issues amongst Gen Z too. Specifically, if you look at national reading and writing scores on the SATs in the U.S. and standardized tests in Canada, those have been getting softer for a long time. And I think it's generally pretty well accepted that Gen Z is less, I don't want to say literate, but their command of language is poorer than it was for millennials at the same point in their lives, right? They read less well, they write more poorly also. So, we're going to see the same thing with Gen Alpha, but it's the continuation of a trend that really starts with the tail end of millennials and with Gen Z as well. And it seems to be largely, the result of people just not reading anymore, right? You can see things like, and I don't have the numbers on the top of my head, but the number of people who read for pleasure, like a book, has declined precipitously over the last 15 years. So, yeah, there is. Is it that damn phone? Yes, it is that damn phone. I'm sorry. Darned screens. Yeah, I mean, it's an opportunity cost, right? The more time you spend on a phone, the less time you spend doing other things, right? There's more forms of entertainment now than there were in the past. It used to be that a good old book was about the best you were going to do. And now, obviously, you can watch an endless barrage of brain-rotting YouTube videos, until your eyeballs bleed. And, that is going to crowd out time for reading. And, the more you read, the better reader you are. So it is that damn phone and that damn TV and that damn PlayStation and all of those dams, none of which will show up when I say damn. Oh, dams, but not spelled dams. Okay. Like a beaver dam. Okay. I love it. On. Okay. Is that where I'm supposed to be? Yes. All right. So, yeah, for 43%, say the racial makeup of their school student body is close to evenly split between white student and students of color, right? So right there, you've got your racial diversity. Less than 1 in 20 say they attend an all-white school, and the remainder are more likely to report attending a majority white school, which again makes sense. White people are still the majority of Americans, so it makes sense they would make up a majority of the young people, right? no conspiracy. Majority white school in a school where other races are in the majority, right? Okay. And yeah, lots of 13-year-olds, regardless of racial identity, say they are close friends with people of different racial groups. And let's, oh, no, that's not what I wanted. Though it tells me where I am, which is always helpful. Okay. So let's have a look here. So, right, this is what it looks like on a beautiful pie chart. I love Springtide does great visualizations. So, right, about a third, right, say their school is mostly white. Only 4% say it's all white. 43% say it's about half white and half other races. 13% say it's mostly other races. And then 8% say it's all other races, right? And again, here you see the kind of split. You know, how 13-year-olds respond to my closest friends are, right? And the most common position for both white people and BIPOC people is, you know, about evenly divided, right? Although you definitely see that, you know, white people are more likely to say, you know, about 30% will say that they're mostly the same race as them, right? So that's a big number as well. So fun stuff there. Unzoom. Okay. Okay. Just dripped on myself. How nice. Pen me, friends. All right. So for our 13-year-olds, right, most of them will say that their racial or ethnic identity has no effect on their opportunities in life, right? So they don't see racial identity as a big barrier. Again, the majority of them are going to be white, so that plays a role as well. Your BIPOC 13-year-olds are obviously more likely to think that, and white 13-year-olds are more likely to feel that their racial identity positively impacts their opportunities, right? So they're aware of some of the racial dynamics of American society. But most of them, regardless of racial identity, don't feel they've been discriminated against because of race or ethnicity, right? So that includes all of your BIPOC people. And again, I'll show you these charts in a sec. But yeah, obviously BIPOC people are much more likely to report this, but still not a majority. All right, let's zoom in here. All right, so here's our 13-year-olds. Have you ever felt discriminated against because of your race or ethnicity? Right, it's about 2/3 of BIPOC people say no, and about 84% of white people say no. Only about 16% of white youngsters say yes, versus 37%. So a little bit more than double the percentages of BIPOC people, but still well short of a majority. So that is probably pretty good. It's a positive number, right? My race or ethnicity makes my opportunities in life, right? For white young people, about a third of them say better. Only about 3 of them say worse. 48% say it has no effect, and it's about 40% of BIPOC people. And then, a solid quarter of BIPOC people are not sure, 16% of white people. But yeah, only about 14% of BIPOC people says it makes it better. And about, just above a fifth say worse. And the last one here, according to 13-year-olds, more racial and ethnic diversity is, right, and you see well in the majority say it is a very good thing. So, almost 30% say a very good thing. 27% say a good thing, right? So we're well above 50% there. And then, the majority of the rest of them say neither a good or a bad thing, right? So they're kind of neutral on it. And only, a tiny percentage of 13-year-olds think that it's a bad thing or a very bad thing, right? It's 10%. So I guess it's 1 in 10, which is a fairly good number, like a fairly big number, rather. But still, really, really small compared to the other groups. Zoom out. Okay. Oh, here's the religion and spirituality stuff I was looking for. Okay, I think interesting here. I probably don't have to zoom in on these. You can probably see them fairly clearly there. All right, pen. So, 74% of 13-year-olds identify as at least slightly religious, right? So, I'm very religious. I'm very spiritual, moderately spiritual, slightly spiritual, right? With only 18% saying they're not spiritual at all. Right, so that's 82%, and 74% of them say they're religious, right? Only 13 say they're very religious, 28 say moderately religious, and 33%, right? So a third say slightly religious, with about a quarter saying they're not religious at all, right? So at least in American society, being spiritual or religious amongst 13-year-olds is a majority position, right? So the vast majority of them consider themselves either religious, at least moderately, or slightly or more, and slightly or more spiritual, with only a relatively small minority saying that they're neither of those things. Okay, so we'll talk more about, I guess, more Gen Z later. I'll zoom in on this so you can see it a little better. I think pretty, when it comes to spirituality and religion, right? They're developing or learning to become a stronger person and have a good relationship with God. People think they need to be more accepting of each other. It's hard being religious because a lot of kids their age don't care about being religious at all, which I think is pretty normal, a normal kind of comment. It's a strange time to be alive. Sometimes worry about the future with how addicted I and my peers are to the internet. But if we have faith, I think we'll be okay, right? So interesting kind of comments there from some of the interviews they did along with this. Ooh, this one. I love this one because I'm a sociology of religion nerd at the end of the day. I love soc of religion. It's like my favorite topic. So these charts, I think, are super interesting, right? About 2/3 of 13-year-olds identify as Christian, and that's roughly the same as the percentage of Americans overall. So they don't seem all that less religious than the rest of the population. And of those, 50% identify as just Christian. Okay, and again, this is kind of nerdy inside the discipline sort of stuff. So you see, right, like basically you've got just Christian at about 50%, 28% of young people consider themselves Catholic, 20% say that they're Protestant, 2% say they are Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, right? Of the percent that say they're Christian, right? So sorry, of the 66% who say they're Christian, half of them say they are just Christian, with these other percentages, and then Mormons at 2% and Eastern Orthodox Christians at like less than 1%. Why I think this is interesting is this just Christian number, and maybe I'll zoom out for a second, does point to something really interesting in terms of both social science and religious identification. A lot of young people, in saying they're just Christian, don't seem to care about institutional labels, right? So they just consider themselves Christian without saying they're Lutheran or Catholic or Pentecostal or whatever. They're, how to put this? They're deinstitutionalized, right, in their thinking. They don't think along kind of sectarian lines, which I think is really, really interesting, right? And it's about half of those who identify as Christian or just Christian also suggests they don't know the history of where these separations came from, and it's not particularly important to them. So a lot of the kind of divisions in Christianity seem to be sort of flowing into this just Christian category, right? So that I think is really interesting. And again, if we go up to this slide. Now, okay, I actually think, I'll say one more thing about just Christian. I really like that Springtide includes just Christian when they ask about religious identity, because I actually think it gets around a really big problem in social science and sociology of religion, which is that there is this movement, for whatever reason, in evangelical Christianity in particular, where people don't identify institutionally. And so there's some relatively significant portion of Christians who will answer no religion on surveys, right? Because, and to put this in crude terms, and you may have heard this if you hung around evangelical Christians enough, They're like, well, it's not a religion, it's a relationship, right? They consider their religious identity more of a relationship with Jesus Christ than actual religion. And so, yeah, if you add just Christian to social science surveys, I think you tend to get better results. Okay, before I nerd out entirely on this, right, this is just your breakdown, right? So 2/3 Christian, so if we combine all of those categories, 8% of young people identify as nothing in particular, so no religion. And a further 7 are agnostic, right? And then where's my atheists? They're in brown. Only about 2% of them, right? So that's, I can't point at anything here because it'll unzoom, but only about 2% of them say that they are atheists, right? And then you have a whole bunch of other stuff, spiritual but not religious at 5%, other at 4%, Muslim at 3%, so not a huge amount. And then you've got your Wicca, Buddhist, Hindu, all at about 1%, right? And Jewish at about 2%. So, right, pretty diverse in terms of that, 1/3 of the population that doesn't consider itself Christian, but it's not like all of that 1/3 is straight up non-religious. They're actually, young people still look, at least in America, look pretty religious, at least by this sample. Okay. I don't know if I have any questions. Yeah, I mean, when we talk about just Christian, it's going to be largely evangelicals, right? Evangelicals, Pentecostals, Baptists will largely answer this way. There's a whole, and anyone who's a non-denominational Christian is typically going to answer this way. Okay. Almost done. We're almost out of time. That's actually perfect. Okay. So, smartphones. For our young people, right, smartphones are pretty universal. Almost 4 in 10. So, let's say, actually, let's zoom in on this. Let's see how universal these things are. So, access to technologies amongst 13-year-olds, right? So, 97% of them said in this sample, right, which is, I think, about 1,200 or 1,112 young people age 13, right? So they did this in 2024. So that's a good sample of American 13-year-olds. 97% of them said they had access to a smartphone. So this is as ubiquitous a social phenomenon as you are ever going to find, right? In almost, aside from breathing air and eating, you will never find social phenomenon that are as ubiquitous as smartphones, right? 97% is huge. 90% of them say they have access to a desktop or laptop computer. 90% of them said they have access to a gaming console, right? So you see how ubiquitous these things are, even across socioeconomic lines, right? A tablet, right? So like an iPad, typically it's 82%. And the only one that is below, them saying they have access to it in some sense, right? Is a virtual reality headset, where only 42% say that they have access to it. And I've never understood the appeal of virtual reality anyway. It always makes me sick. Okay. In general, I am on, how much time do they spend on their phones, right? So you see like only 2% say it's, so right around that percentage that say they don't have access to a phone, right? 0 hours a day. Almost 1 in 5 say it's 1 to 2 hours a day. 2 in 5, right, or 40%, say it's 3 to 4 hours a day. For a quarter, it's 5 to 6 hours a day on their phone, which is a lot, right? And then, for 1 in 5, or a little less than 1 in 5, it's 6 hours a day, right? So if you were just walking down, the hallways of any particular junior high, about 1 out of every 5 students you meet is going to spend, 6 hours a day or more on their smartphone, right? So we see this, on average, they spend quite a bit of time on smartphones, right? At least 3 to 4 hours a day or more. Okay, and how many of them say that they're addicted to their smartphones? No majority positions here, right? 43%, right? So a little bit more than 2/5 agree that they're addicted to their smartphones. Just below 2/5, say that they disagree with that. And then, 1/5 say they're not sure or neither agree nor disagree, right? So again, pretty strong sense that, while addiction is a very specific pathology, and I don't always love the language of smartphone addiction, some of them do at least feel that they are addicted to their smartphones, a fairly good number of them, right? So something to take into account. Okay. I just stared straight at the projector for a second, and now I have little blue dots in my vision, which is always fun, right? Okay. All right, so a similar proportion, right? All right, we already said that, so I don't need to go through that again. All right, cool. All right, social media. Almost all of our 13-year-olds, 99%. So again, talk about your pretty universal social phenomenon. Report using social media. YouTube, TikTok, and Snapchat are especially popular amongst teenagers, right? So no surprises there. YouTube, very popular. TikTok, obviously very popular as well. Snapchat, the one that surprises me because I always forget that it exists. But again, I'm 43, so what the hell do I know? But yeah. And when I ask the reason they use social media, what do they say, right? Social connection, knowledge sharing, and creativity, right? Now we'll zoom in on this just to take a look, at our dominant platforms. Okay, so this is obviously one of those situations where it's a survey question that's select all that apply. But about 82% of 13-year-olds report using YouTube once a day or more. 2/3, 65% say they use TikTok. About a little over half say Snapchat, and then Facebook. Wow, I'm shocked Facebook is that high. My parents are on Facebook, and they're really old. So, I thought it wasn't cool anymore. But about 45%, 41% on Instagram. Twitter X, if that number could be closer to 0, that would be better. I love Twitter, but it is a cesspool, a hive of scum and villainy. So about 1/5 of them say they use Twitter on at least once a day. Twitch, right, the game streaming platform. I only say that so you know that I know what these things are. You don't think I'm old and don't know what I'm doing. Right, so Twitch, a little bit less than 1/5. And then Reddit, 13%. I thought that one would be higher. Be Real, which I don't think exists anymore. Maybe it does. It was a very niche-y kind of social media platform a few years ago where you're supposed to take pictures, I think, or videos of your real life. So you would be real. It was dumb, but apparently 9% of teenagers in 2024 liked it. And then Threads, Facebook's desperate attempt to copy Twitter, which apparently 8% of teenagers use once a day or more. Maybe they're lying. I don't know. Okay. All right. Now, how am I doing for time? Doing okay. So, now, social media, and here, that hasn't happened in a bit. So, relatively weak link to mental illness. And, we're going to get some contradictory information in this class. And I think, it's good to present different sides of the coin. I'm pretty sold on there being a link between, increasing mental illness and social media and smartphone use in young people. This report finds, something slightly different, but I'll kind of try to go through and explain what I see here. 13-year-olds, right, who use their phones more, only slightly more likely to report feeling unhappy or depressed, right, worried or anxious, or lonely over the past month. Those who report spending more time on social media, again, only slightly more likely to report feeling worse about themselves after using the platform. Okay, I want to zoom in on this. I'll talk about it a little bit. Zoom. There we go. Okay, so what do you see here, right? Average self-reported unhappiness on a 5-point scale for 13-year-olds and smartphone use per day, right? So we see there is a little bit of a correlation. As you move up in terms of hours spent on social media, they do score slightly higher. Same thing when we talk about, average self-reported anxiety for 13-year-olds and smartphone use per day. Again, what you see is, obviously, your least anxious are the ones spending 0 hours on social media or on a smartphone per day. What's the top one? Was that smartphone use per day? Oh, average self-reported unhappiness. Average self-reported anxiety, right? Oh, that's anxiety, right? Again, the more you use it, there is a slight but weak correlation between the two. And the same thing with loneliness, right? Again, at 1.8, it's a little bit lower than 2.5 for that group using the most social media or smartphones a day, right? So there is a correlation, and definitely as you use more social media, you do rise in all 3 of these measures. Now, let me zoom back out here. I do think, and again, I'll put my cards on the table. I think the evidence that smartphones and social media, especially heavy use of them, tends to lead to increased rates of anxiety. I think it's pretty strong. Now, that said, I do think one of the things we see, and here, let me grab my pen. Let's go in a different color, change from the red, is that because these technologies are so ubiquitous, right, even the people who don't use them are likely still being affected by these technologies, right? So the effects are more generalized on a social level and less on an individual level, right? So we get later in the course, we'll see that we've seen big jumps in things like depression, loneliness, and anxiety amongst Gen Z. And I think one of the things we see is because the whole cohort is involved in use of these technologies at pretty high rates, the effects are going to be dispersed whether an individual uses the technologies or not, right? Because you might be the one without a smartphone looking to hang out and play basketball, but if everybody else is inside, playing NBA on their PlayStation, right, you're going to have a hard time finding that, right? Okay. But again, we'll dig into that more as we go along. All right, no questions. Okay, politics. And how am I doing? Just curious where I'm at here. Oh, I'm on my last slide. I guess I could have just been patient. Okay, politics. And as I've kind of noted, right, politics, not a big thing for Gen Alpha yet. And I don't think we would expect it to be, right? Teenagers don't tend to be overly political, right? They don't tend to have really strong political opinions because they're just not tuned in and they're not interested in that for the most part. That's going to come as they get a little bit older, right? They're going to develop stronger kind of political takes. So, basically, and we can see it here. What's the biggest number? I don't know, right? How 13-year-olds identify their political ideology. 41% say they don't know, right? And then some split between, about a fifth, conservative, moderate, and liberal, right? About a fifth each. And generally speaking, do you usually think of yourself as a Republican, Democrat, Independent, or something else? And again, same thing. 41% say they don't know. With Democrat definitely leading the other contenders, at about a quarter. Republican being 17%, so really close to that conservative number. Independent, right, at 13%, and none or other at about 5%, right? So it's a generation that's still pretty unformed. You definitely see the beginnings of political identities taking shape, right, in these parts of the graphs, but still pretty unformed in general. Okay, there's no further questions, so that is good. I mean, I could start another one, but let's just leave it at this, and we'll come back on Wednesday, and we're going to talk education, and we're going to talk about what happens next week on Wednesday with the midterm. So yeah, let's do that. Okay.